You know that feeling, right? That kind of knot in your stomach when you look at the headlines. Inflation, national debt, maybe whispers of a recession.
Yeah, it's a lot, like navigating a storm of information.
Exactly, often contradictory information. And trying to make sense of these huge economic forces shaping our lives, sometimes finding a way forward means really rethinking ideas we thought were just set in stone.
And what's fascinating is that sometimes those radical new ways of thinking, they aren't actually new at all.
Right. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a concept from the past, a brilliant, profoundly simple, yet pretty shocking idea that just flew directly in the face of traditional sound finance principles way back in the 1940s.
It's called functional finance, and it came from the economist Abba Lerner. And as you'll see, its whole framework completely flips the script on conventional wisdom about how governments should manage money and, well, the economy.
Okay, so let's unpack this. For this deep dive, we've been digging into a stack of source material, mainly Lerner's own really foundational 1943 paper, Functional Finance and the Federal Debt, and also a report analyzing his work and its legacy.
And our mission here is to pull out the key ideas from these sources. We want to understand this radical theory, what it actually is, why it was so controversial, how it connects to Keynesian economics and maybe modern ideas like MMT, and what it might mean for the United States economy, but only based on what these sources tell us.
All right, let's jump in then. Functional finance. What's the absolute core principle, the thing that really sets it apart?
The most fundamental idea, really, is that government fiscal and monetary policy, spending, taxing, borrowing, even creating money, should only be judged by its effects on the economy,
Okay.
not by some sort of traditional, almost moralistic rules like always balancing the budget.
So it's about the outcome, the function, rather than sticking to a rigid form or tradition. Lerner called this applying the method of science as opposed to scholasticism to finance. That's a great way to put it.
Precisely. And he used a simple analogy. The government isn't just a passive bystander. It needs to actively steer the economy, like driving a car, right, to get it where it needs to go towards goals like full employment and stable prices.
Right, you can't just set the car going and hope it finds the right destination, which is kind of the hope of pure laissez-faire economics sometimes.
Exactly. It rejects that passive approach.
Okay, so what's the main destination? Where should the government be steering towards? What's the primary goal according to functional finance?
The first and most critical goal is to keep the total rate of spending in the country at the level that's just enough to buy all the production the economy is capable of at current prices.
Right.
If spending's too low, you get unemployment, businesses can't sell everything they could make. If spending's too high, you just drive up prices. That's inflation.
Got it. Enough spending to use all resources and labor, but not so much it causes prices to spiral. So how does the government, using this functional approach, use its main tools, spending and taxing, to hit that sweet spot?
It's pretty direct, actually. If total spending is too low and you've got unemployment, the government should either increase its own spending or cut taxes.
Okay.
Both actions put more money into the economy, boosting total spending.
Makes sense.
If total spending is too high, causing inflation, the government does the opposite. It spends less or raises taxes to pull money out of the economy and cool things down.
And this is where it starts to sound really different, isn't it? From how most of us think about government finances. The first shocking implication is about taxes. The sources say taxation is never primarily about the government getting money.
That's one of the most counterintuitive points, definitely. According to functional finance, a government that issues its own currency doesn't need to tax or borrow to literally fund its spending. It can simply create the money.
Create it, okay.
So the purpose of taxation isn't to collect revenue. Its main effect, and therefore its functional purpose, is that it leaves taxpayers with less money to spend. Therefore, you should only tax when you need to reduce the public spending, like when total spending in the economy is too high and causing inflation.
Wow. So tax is basically a tool to manage demand and fight inflation, not a way for the government to fill its pockets. That completely flips the usual idea. And there's a similar twist for government borrowing.
Yes, the second shocking corollary is about borrowing, which means selling government bonds. Functional finance says the government should borrow money only if it's desirable for the public to hold less ready cash and more government bonds.
Why would that be desirable?
Maybe if interest rates are too low, for instance, and encouraging excessive investment that could lead to inflation, selling bonds pulls cash out and pushes rates up. Conversely, the government should lend or repay debt, buy back bonds, only if it's desirable to increase the public's cash holdings or decrease the bonds they hold, maybe to lower interest rates.
So just like taxing, borrowing isn't mainly about funding the government spending either. It's a tool to manage interest rates and influence the mix of assets the public holds cash versus bonds.
Exactly. And if the government decides to spend more than it takes in through taxes, which, remember, are for managing demand, not funding, and it doesn't need to borrow for interest rate reasons, well, the difference simply must be met by creating new money.
Creating new money. Okay, that's the classic fear, isn't it? Printing money leads straight to hyperinflation.
Lerner tackles this head-on in the source material. He argues that creating money this way doesn't cause inflation all by itself. Inflation, he insists, is controlled by that first rule, managing the total rate of spending in the economy through taxing and government spending levels.
Okay.
The money creation part is just the technical means to carry out the spending when the functional needs controlling demand. Managing interest rates don't call for taxing or borrowing. He also points out, interestingly, that when the government borrows from banks, and banks then issue new credit based on those bonds, that's effectively expanding the money supply anyway.
So if I'm following this, functional finance just completely rejects the traditional rules of sound finance. The idea that the budget has to balance over some arbitrary period. The focus is purely on hitting those functional goals, full employment, stable prices, using whatever tool is needed no matter what the budget looks like.
That's the essence, yes. And Lerner boiled this down into 3 explicit rules he argued a government should follow.
Okay, lay out those rules for us.
Rule number 1. The government shall maintain a reasonable level of total demand at all times. If spending's too low, causing unemployment, spend more or tax less. If spending's too high, causing inflation, spend less or tax more. That's the direct steering mechanism.
Makes sense. Aligns with the core goal. What's rule 2?
Rule number 2. The government shall maintain the rate of interest that encourages the optimum amount of investment. It does this by selling bonds to raise rates, or repaying debt, or increasing the money supply to lower rates. This is about making sure the economy invests properly for the future.
Okay. And rule number 3. This is the one that really throws the traditional rule book out the window, right?
Absolutely. Rule number 3. If either of the first 2 rules conflicts with principles of sound finance, like balancing the budget or limiting the national debt, so much the worse for these principles.
Wow. That's pretty blunt.
It leaves absolutely no room for doubt. This rule also explicitly says the government must create money, if that's what's needed, to carry out rules 1 and 2, assuming taxing or borrowing aren't functionally appropriate at that moment. It just puts economic performance firmly above traditional financial rules.
Okay, so that's the framework. But why was this so radical, even for people who kind of agreed with Keynes? And where does that really deep-seated fear of a continually increasing national debt fit in?
Well, functional finance definitely built on Keynes' ideas about aggregate demand and government intervention, no question. But, as the sources point out, Lerner just took these ideas to their most logical and maybe politically uncomfortable conclusion.
How so?
Earlier ideas, like pump priming or trying to balance the budget over the business cycle, still kind of hoped everything would balance out eventually, maybe automatically once you hit full employment. Lerner showed there's just no theoretical guarantee that achieving full employment will result in a balanced budget.
And if maintaining full employment consistently required the government to spend more than it taxed, and that gap was filled by borrowing,
then the national debt would logically just keep growing. And this is the point where traditionalists and even some, more politically cautious Keynesians got really worried. The sources quote critics arguing that sustained deficit spending and a growing national debt pose a fundamental danger, specifically to the private enterprise system.
Yes, I saw that argument laid out. The fear is deficits make debt grow. Paying interest on that debt needs high taxes. High taxes discourage risky private investment because the potential reward after tax isn't worth the risk, which then forces the government to spend even more to prop things up, leading to higher taxes for even more interest on even bigger debt. A vicious cycle that eventually crushes private enterprise and leads to government control. Is that the idea?
That critique is laid out very clearly in the sources, framed as the belief that deficit spending is basically the surest way to kill private enterprise. And it's worth noting, as the source does, this exact kind of doom and gloom argument about high taxes and debt leading to ruin and government takeover, it was used against the very first proposals for an income tax.
Fascinating how those fears recycle. So how does Lerner, using the functional finance logic, actually take apart this powerful sounding critique against deficits and debt?
Lerner, in his paper, points out four major errors in that whole anti-deficit argument. These are really key points from the sources.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first flaw, according to Lerner?
The first error, Lerner says, is the whole idea that high income taxes automatically discourage risky investment. This only seems true if you forget that business losses are often fully deductible from taxable income. The source gives a great example. Imagine someone earning $50 a year thinking about risking $10 for a potential 6% return, so $600 income. If the tax rate is 60%, your net income is just $240. Critics say $240 isn't enough reward for risking $10,000.
But that's only looking at the upside.
Exactly. Lerner points out, what if the $10,000 investment is lost? If that loss is 60% deductible, the actual net loss after the tax deduction is only $4,000. So the real return on the capital actually risked by the investor is still 6% $240 profit on $4,000 risked.
Huh.
He basically says the rich investor acts like a commission agent for society. They only get part of the gain, but they only risk part of the loss too. High income tax, if it comes with full loss deductibility, doesn't kill risky investment. It just scales it down.
Okay, that's a really sharp point. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. What's the second error the critics make?
Second, Lerner argues that even if you were to accept the premise that the national debt is some kind of burden on society, which he contests, objecting to deficit spending that maintains full employment, is still illogical.
Why?
Because the economic loss to society from unemployment is way bigger, several times greater, than the government spending needed to fix it. Thanks to the multiplier effect, right?
Yeah.
Every dollar the government spends creates more than a dollar of economic activity. The source uses an analogy. It's like being unemployed and turning down a job, because you have to pay your spouse interest on some of your earnings. The income you gain from the job vastly outweighs the supposed burden of an internal interest transfer.
So you're focusing on a small internal transfer, the interest payment, while ignoring the massive real loss of output and income from unemployment. Got it.
Precisely. The third error Lerner identifies. There's no functional reason the government has to raise all the interest payments on the national debt through current taxes. Functional finance says you tax only when needed to curb inflation. Right. If taxes aren't needed for inflation control, the interest on the debt can simply be paid by borrowing more, or fundamentally, by creating the money. As long as you're managing total spending according to Rule 1, paying interest this way doesn't automatically cause inflation.
So the fear that debt interest requires crushing taxes is based on a sound finance assumption that functional finance just throws out.
Exactly. The sources even give this fantastic kind of extreme example. Imagine an economy with a $10 trillion national debt, paying $300 billion a year in interest, but its real productive capacity only generates $150 billion of real income. Critics would scream, you can't tax $300 billion from $150 billion of income to pay the interest. You'll destroy everything.
Yeah, sounds impossible.
But under functional finance, the total money income in that economy would actually be $450 billion, $150 billion from producing stuff, plus $300 billion from government interest payments flowing to bondholders. If the government then taxes $300 billion back to pay the interest, again, only if needed to stop total spending exceeding output, the public is left with $150 billion to spend, which is precisely enough to buy the $150 billion worth of real goods and services without causing inflation.
Wow.
The debt size and interest payments, in this view, are mainly an internal transfer within society, not a net burden on society's ability to produce and consume.
That example is incredibly counterintuitive, but really powerful in explaining the FF perspective. It highlights how different the core assumptions are. What's the fourth and final error in the critics' view?
Lerner argues there's actually no theoretical reason why applying functional finance should necessarily lead to a national debt that increases forever.
Wait, but didn't we just say a growing debt could be the logical outcome of consistent deficits needed for full employment?
It could be, yes. But Lerner argues it's not necessarily an uncontrolled infinite spiral. He gives several reasons why debt growth might stop or be managed. First, remember, the government can use money creation instead of borrowing to finance deficits, which doesn't increase the debt itself.
Okay.
Second, guaranteeing permanent full employment actually makes private investment less risky and potentially more attractive, which could reduce the need for government deficit spending over time.
Interesting.
Third, as national income rises due to full employment, and as the debt itself grows, increasing private wealth held in bonds, the tax yield from higher incomes and inheritances also rises naturally. This could help service the debt without needing higher tax rates, specifically for inflation control or reducing overall spending.
And the most intriguing reason, the self-balancing force you mentioned.
Yes, this is key. As the national debt grows, the amount of private wealth held by people and companies increases because government bonds are private assets, right? Lerner argues that having more wealth tends to reduce people's incentive to save out of their current income. If you feel wealthier, you tend to spend a bit more of what you earn. This increase in private spending means less government deficit spending is needed to maintain full employment.
Okay.
Eventually, the national debt could reach a level where private spending, boosted by this wealth effect from holding all those government bonds, is sufficient on its own to generate full employment. At that point, the government budget would automatically balance and the debt would stop growing. Lerner, writing back in 1943, guessed this equilibrium level might be between $100 and $300 billion for the U.S. then.
An equilibrium debt level determined by the economy's need for private wealth to sustain full employment spending. That's a concept you definitely don't hear every day.
And he adds one more thing. Even if the government did want to limit how much private wealth and thus debt accumulated, it could choose to tax wealth or high incomes instead of borrowing from the wealthy to finance its spending. He argued this wouldn't significantly hurt the wealthy spending or the economy, but it would keep the debt level lower.
So just to recap Lerner's counterarguments, debt doesn't have to grow forever. Interest doesn't require crushing taxes. Even if interest is taxed, it's just a transfer, far less costly than mass unemployment. And high taxes with loss deductions don't actually kill risky investment. It's a wholesale rejection of the critic's basic premise.
Exactly. He argued they were stuck thinking in sound finance terms, applying household logic to a sovereign government instead of thinking functionally about macroeconomic outcomes.
Another key point from the source. Lerner argued functional finance isn't tied to any specific political system, not democracy, not private enterprise.
Right. He saw it as a kind of neutral technical toolkit. Principles for using monetary and fiscal levers effectively to achieve economic goals like full employment and price stability. Like any powerful tool, he thought, it could be used by any system, communist, fascist, democratic.
So its relevance to democracy or private enterprise isn't inherent.
His point was more practical. Societies that do use these principles effectively to achieve prosperity are likely to be more stable and successful than those that don't. So it gives an advantage. It's a means to an end, not an ideological end in itself.
That distinction feels important. Okay, let's look at its place in history. How did this radical idea relate to the mainstream Keynesian economics of the time? And what did Keynes himself actually think of it?
Well, functional finance definitely shares that core Keynesian focus on effective demand, the need for government intervention, tackling unemployment. That's the common ground. But as we've discussed, Lerner really pushed the implications further. He was much more explicit, much more consistent in arguing that achieving full employment and price stability should be the only criteria for fiscal policy, even if it meant just ignoring traditional budget or debt rules.
And that starkness, that unflinching acceptance of potentially growing debt, that was the really shocking part, even for some Keynesians.
Absolutely. It was quite startling. The sources even tell this story about the economist Evsey Domar suggesting to Keynes himself that maybe he should reread his own general theory after Keynes criticized Lerner's deficit ideas. The implication being, maybe Lerner was just applying Keynes' own logic more consistently than Keynes was comfortable admitting publicly.
So how did Keynes really feel about functional finance? What's the balance between his private thoughts and public statements?
It seems it was complicated. Privately, Keynes apparently found Lerner's logical case impeccable and praised his book as grand stuff, recognizing its originality. But he had major reservations about its practical implementation and, crucially, public acceptance. He worried intensely about selling these ideas to, as he put it, the plain man, or uninstructed public opinion, because it clashed so strongly with ingrained natural instincts about thrift and balanced budgets.
So he respected the theory but doubted the politics. He thought it was too radical for the real world.
Pretty much. He drew a clear line between functional finance as a valuable apparatus of thought, a way to analyze things, and a direct apparatus of action or policy, which he felt needed major caveats. He even publicly called Lerner's ideas about potentially ever-mounting deficits humbug in one seminar, which apparently really upset Lerner.
Why such strong public pushback if he thought the logic was sound?
Keynes worried that a lack of public understanding could lead to what he called false consciousness among people and, importantly, in financial markets. He feared adverse reactions to deficit policies driven by misunderstanding, not economic reality. He felt Lerner didn't fully grapple with these real difficulties, like potential upward pressure on interest rates if markets got spooked, or the distributional effects who ends up holding all that growing debt.
Okay, so despite Keynes' own reservations about applying it raw, the sources note that Lerner's functional finance rules actually became quite influential, foundational even for what we call textbook Keynesianism after World War II.
That's a critical point, yes.
Yeah.
The post-war economic consensus, the stuff that ended up in standard textbooks, really adopted the idea of actively using monetary and fiscal policy as a balance wheel to stabilize aggregate demand and keep employment high. This systematic, almost rule-based approach to counter-cyclical policy. You could argue it's more directly derived from Lerner's explicit rules for managing demand and interest rates than from Keynes' own, perhaps more nuanced or cautious policy views.
So even if Keynes had doubts about the pure theory as immediate policy, Lerner's framework really shaped how Keynesian ideas were taught and understood for a whole generation.
It seems so. It provided a clearer, more actionable framework, even if it sanded off some of Keynes' complexities and political anxieties.
Let's fast forward to today then. Where do we see the echoes or the legacy of functional finance now? And how does it connect to modern monetary theory, or SMT? That's a phrase a lot of people have heard recently.
Right, MMT explicitly positions itself as a direct intellectual descendant of functional finance. It builds on Lerner's work, along with other traditions like chartalism and the work of people like Minsky and Godley.
Okay, so what are the key overlaps? Where do FF and MMT sound similar?
Well, like functional finance, MMT starts with the idea that a monetarily sovereign government, one that issues its own currency, like the US or Japan, isn't financially constrained like a household or a business.
Meaning it can't run out of its own money.
Essentially, yes. It can always create the money it needs to pay for things denominated in its own currency. Also, mirroring functional finance, MMT sees taxing and borrowing not primarily as ways to fund government spending.
Right, we covered that. Taxing manages demand, borrowing manages interest rates.
Exactly. And both frameworks view budget deficits or surpluses as just the outcome of pursuing macroeconomic goals, like full employment and price stability. They're not targets in themselves. You aim for the goals, and the budget deficit or surplus is just whatever it happens to be.
Okay, so where might they differ? Or where has MMT maybe built on or emphasized things differently than Lerner?
One area of emphasis that sometimes seems different is the role of monetary policy, specifically interest rates. Some interpretations suggest MMT places even less emphasis on using interest rates Lerner's Rule 2 for inflation control, arguing instead that aggressive taxation is the primary tool.
Okay.
And a really significant development within MMT is its focus on a specific flagship policy proposal, the job guarantee.
Ah, yes, the JG.
Right. This is a program where the government would offer a job at a living wage to absolutely anyone who wants one. The idea is it acts as a powerful automatic stabilizer. During downturns, people lose private sector jobs, move into the JG program, which keeps spending up. During upturns, they move out of the JG into better-paying private jobs, which reduces government spending and helps prevent overheating.
So while Lerner aimed for full employment generally, the job guarantee is a specific, concrete mechanism proposed by MMTers to achieve that.
Exactly. It's a specific institutional design put forward by key MMT proponents. You might have heard of people like Warren Mosler, Randy Ray, Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, Pavlina Cherneva.
And the criticisms lobbed at MMT today, they sound remarkably similar to the ones aimed at functional finance way back when.
They really do, don't they? You hear the exact same fears, warnings of runaway inflation, even hyperinflation, often citing historical examples like Weimar Germany or Venezuela, whether relevant or not. Accusations of fiscal irresponsibility, concerns about debt sustainability, the argument that it undermines private enterprise. Mainstream economists, by and large, remain pretty critical of MMT's core claims, especially about the lack of financial constraint and the inflation mechanism.
Let's try to connect this explicitly to the United States economy and some recent history. The sources mention that the policy responses to the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic actually showed an operational logic pretty similar to functional finance principles. What did that look like in practice?
Yeah, think back to 2008. We were facing a potential meltdown of the financial system, a really deep recession. What did the U.S. government and the Fed do? Extraordinary, unprecedented things.
Right, huge bailouts, stimulus.
Massive fiscal stimulus packages, TARP bailouts, the Fed's balance sheet more than doubling through quantitative easing. The absolute top priority was stopping a total economic collapse and stabilizing the financial system. It was a whatever-it-takes moment. Immediate worries about deficits and the national debt. They basically took a back seat to achieving that critical macroeconomic outcome, financial stability. That prioritization is fundamentally aligned with functional finance logic.
And during the COVID-19 pandemic, that kind of response seemed even more pronounced, didn't it?
Absolutely. We saw governments everywhere unleash fiscal support on a scale never seen in peacetime. Trillions in deficits globally.
Yep.
Here in the U.S., deficits hit record peacetime levels, something like 17% of GDP at one point.
Wow.
And the central banks, including the Fed, actively facilitated this, kept interest rates near zero, bought up government debt. The focus was squarely on keeping households afloat, keeping businesses viable, propping up aggregate demand to prevent a full-blown depression. They accepted massive increases in government debt as a necessary consequence.
Even traditionally more conservative institutions seemed on board.
Yeah, even the IMF, often seen as fiscally cautious, was saying further support is necessary, despite the already high debt levels. And looking back, most analyses suggest these interventions, guided by prioritizing economic outcomes over traditional fiscal rules, prevented a much deeper economic catastrophe. This de facto prioritization in a crisis, it maps very closely onto the core logic of functional finance.
It really sounds like when the chips are truly down, policymakers instinctively act like functional financiers, even if they'd never used that label.
There's a strong case to be made there. Crises seem to strip away the adherence to traditional rules and force a focus on functional outcomes. It demonstrates the operational capacity that FS describes, even if the theoretical framework isn't explicitly acknowledged.
What about Japan? That case comes up a lot in MMT discussions. They have an incredibly high debt-to-GDP ratio, but still have persistently low inflation and low interest rates. How does that fit?
Japan's experience is definitely often held up by MMT proponents as real-world evidence. Evidence that a monetarily sovereign nation isn't fiscally constrained in the way conventional economics predicts. Japan seems to defy the warnings of runaway inflation or soaring interest rates that are normally associated with such high debt levels.
But is it deliberate functional finance?
Well, that's the debate. The sources point out that Japanese officials themselves deny implementing MMT or anything like it. Critics argue Japan's situation isn't really about deliberate functional finance. It's more a result of a long history of sort of stop-go stimulus attempts, sometimes followed by premature austerity, and accumulating debt, largely because economic growth has been weak. So automatic stabilizers like unemployment benefits kick in, rather than a conscious FF strategy to maintain full employment.
So it's maybe more of a Japan paradox, orthodox policy intentions perhaps, but leading to outcomes high debt without high inflation that nonetheless challenge orthodox economic predictions.
That seems to be a common framing, yes. Regardless of the intent, the outcome in Japan, high debt coexisting with low inflation and low rates for decades, poses a significant puzzle for conventional thinking, and that's why it becomes relevant to the FFMMT discussion.
And these ideas, functional finance and MMT, they pop up in other current economic debates too, right? Like discussions about secular stagnation or financing huge projects like climate change mitigation.
Absolutely. In periods of secular stagnation, when interest rates are already near zero and traditional monetary policy loses its punch, the argument for proactive fiscal policy, the core of functional finance, naturally gains traction. It seems like the only tool left to really boost demand.
And climate change.
Similarly, when you think about the massive public investment needed for, say, a green energy transition, the functional finance perspective is highly relevant. It suggests the primary constraint isn't about the government finding the money a sovereign government can create or borrow its own currency to finance it. The real constraints are managing the actual resources needed, the labor, the materials, and ensuring that the increased spending doesn't cause bottlenecks and resource-driven inflation. It shifts the focus from financial constraints to real resource constraints.
And the sources even mentioned a couple of U.S. political touch points, the Reagan deficits and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mentioning MMT.
Yeah, just brief mentions showing these ideas aren't purely academic. The large deficits under Reagan, whatever the supply-side justification given at the time, happened alongside economic expansion, leading some to note the outcomes had a certain resemblance to what functional finance might predict. And AOC mentioning MMT just shows that the modern version of these ideas has entered contemporary political conversation in the U.S. We're just reporting what the sources noted here, of course, not taking any political side.
Understood. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive then. Functional finance was this really radical challenge to traditional sound finance. It argued government policy should be judged purely by its functional outcomes, achieving full employment and price stability. It offered a clear, though definitely controversial, toolkit.
And despite facing valid critiques, especially around political feasibility, the difficulty of fine-tuning in practice,
Yeah.
and maybe controlling inflation that isn't just simple demand pull. And despite Keynes' own reservations about applying it directly, its core logic really influenced post-war economics. It shaped the whole idea of using policy as an economic stabilizer, particularly in textbook Keynesianism.
And its core ideas clearly haven't disappeared. They live on, most visibly now, in modern monetary theory. And crucially, when major crises hit, like 2008 or COVID, policymakers seem almost compelled by necessity to adopt priorities that look a lot like functional finance, putting economic outcomes ahead of strict adherence to traditional fiscal rules, even if they don't call it that.
Functional finance and MMT today, you could see them as this kind of evergreen set of ideas. They keep resurfacing, especially when conventional approaches seem to be faltering, forcing us to re-examine fundamental questions about what a sovereign government can do, and maybe should do, to maintain economic stability for its citizens.
Which leads us right to the final provocative thought offered by the sources. The ongoing debate around these ideas isn't just about the pure economic logic, is it? It's also deeply tangled up with the tension between achieving desirable economic function and operating within our existing political form.
Exactly. Can our political institutions, can public consensus, can the level of trust within society actually handle the immense power that functional finance describes? The power to create and destroy money, to directly steer the economy. Can we wield that power responsibly without it being misused or distorted by short-term political goals or pressures?
It becomes a question about governance, really, about the practical limits of managing a complex economy and whether our political system and our societal norms are actually equipped to handle such powerful tools effectively and fairly for everyone. It's as much about politics and trust as it is about economic theory itself. Really makes you think.
Indeed, it does.